Hello again, everyone. You're joining us for another episode of Executive Platform's Blueprint podcast series. My name is Jeff Nix. I'm head of content and research. My guest today is Rob Konferowicz of CCH Tagetik. We're going to be having a conversation about how people should look at EPM systems. What are some of the right questions to be asking as you weigh pros and cons? I think it's going to be a great conversation. Rob, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having us. Yeah, appreciate it, Jeff.
So why don't we start off by maybe talking about the lay of the land in terms of where are EPMs today, what has changed, why are people making some decisions about how they want to move forward?
Yeah. So, the EPM world's changed a lot. So I would say, right now you've got a lot of players, especially in the planning space. It's a relatively competitive, saturated market. So there's a lot of, point solutions that, aim to address maybe one piece of the overall puzzle. You've got some mega vendors out there as well, the big reds and the big blues out there that, have legacy solutions that are getting to an end of life and end of maintenance. So they obviously have new tools on the cloud as well. So their, organizations are, evaluating if they should migrate or if they should look at alternatives. And you also have some of these next gen EPM tools out there as well, aiming to be platform players in the EPM space.
Now, I try to put myself in the position of an executive who has to make a decision like this. You are sort of locking yourself into a long-term partnership solution. You want to make the right choice. What are some of the things that they should be educating themselves about, thinking about as they go into that decision cycle?
Yeah, ideally it's a long-term partnership, right? Because if
otherwise you made a mistake.
Yeah, exactly. So, definitely, if things run smoothly, it should be like a 10-year partnership. But, I would say I would even put in the context of, are you replacing a current tool with, a new tool, or are you, shopping around for something for the first time, right? I think that maybe adds a layer of complexity, but, if you're somebody coming off a legacy EPM tool, it's coming end of life, one of the things I would recommend, a lot of the organizations I talk to, when they reach out to us, they've got kind of a wish list of, hey, I love X, Y, and Z of my current provider, but I don't like 1, 2, and 3. And they provide that information. Of course, we work through that. But from our perspective, it kind of puts these organizations in kind of a locked kind of view, right? And it starts becoming a feature function driven type of evaluation. So even if you have a consolidation tool, right, and you're looking for a new one, we definitely advise organizations to take a step back, because consolidation has changed a lot over the last 10 years, right? Or, whenever they may have implemented their legacy solution. So you've got new regulatory requirements with like global minimum tax. There's this whole ESG world, not getting political, but especially in Europe, there's required reporting under that umbrella. You've got account reconciliation that used to be kind of its own space that's sort of crept into the EPM world. So it's important for these organizations not to just say, hey, we have this, and now I want this in a new tool, but better for these three things. And it oftentimes helps taking a step back and taking a lay of the land first. What are some of the business requirements beyond just what we're replacing that we can potentially bring some automation into?
Now, when I think of, hey, I'm buying a tool that is going to hopefully last me 10 years, I also want to put it in the context of, I feel like all the tools are changing right now. There's conversations about AI. There's conversations about what is going to happen with all the data. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that before we move on. Yeah.
So, I think it's a great topic, and it's rarely something that shows in product demos, right? So as organizations try and evaluate software, there's a lot of emphasis on the demos. Of course, you want to see what the product looks like in action, but a lot of the demos sometimes are kind of high level or, face level and not really going behind the scenes. So when we talk about modern technology, the data explosion with, the Office of the CFO trying to be more of like a business partner to the organization, which requires a ton of data. You've got AI, which everyone's talking about, also requires a lot of data. I think it's important for organizations evaluating software to understand architecturally how can that tool or that vendor scale as hopefully these organizations tackle new changes in the from a regulatory perspective, or bring in more data, more granular data, more history to take advantage of some of the cool things that software vendors are doing now with AI and predictions and automation.
Would another factor to consider be sort of cultural fit? I mean, when you're talking about like regulatory compliance, like there should be a meeting of minds in terms of philosophy. You're not necessarily looking for the best cost. You want there to be a what is the service element attached to it? Is that part of the conversation?
Yeah, and if it's not, it certainly should be. So, there's always product, there's people, there's process. The people aspect, right? So the folks working with your organization on the implementation, the change management, the support after, go live, I think, it's oftentimes overlooked in these software evaluations. And honestly, oftentimes it's one of the clearest correlation factors to a successful implementation. Great tool, but with a bad implementation, you're not going to get great results. So we're huge proponents because if you think about these organizations making these investments into challenging software implementations, they're essentially hiring people, right, to be on their team for 3 months, 6 months. In the ERP space, could even be multiple years. So, interviewing these folks, understanding, individuals' experience and less so like firm-wide expertise, I think is critical. And a component of that you were mentioning, cultural alignment. How do we work together? Will the services arm of this software vendor challenge the company or the organization, going through the implementation to rethink business processes or, maybe push back when it makes sense? So the cultural alignment, I think, is overlooked but critical.
So to build on that a little, I mean, again, I'm putting myself in the position of I'm an executive who's been tasked with making this charge. The first couple of conversations are with business development people, and they have a role to play. They're saying, this is what we offer, this is how we think it's going to fit. At what point do you also say, okay, but who's going to be my ongoing relationship? Can I talk to that person? Like, where does that conversation happen?
Yeah, I'm sure that's, vendor, it's different by different vendors. So I can't speak to maybe all of them out there. I know from a CCH Tagetik perspective, the main points of contact we try and get in pretty much, as early as possible, right? So if we see that there's a technological fit with our solution and a prospective organization's business requirements, right, that kind of becomes a qualified opportunity, behind the scenes, and pretty much right from there, we've got our customer success managers or our, relationship executives aligned to that customer even before they're a customer. So I don't know if every company out there does that. That's our approach, and we see a lot of benefits with that, especially because the people promising you things early on in your software evaluation should also stick around for the implementation to make sure software vendors, uphold to what was promised, how things work, and certainly after go live as well to, ensure things are running smoothly, the customer's autonomous, and above all else, they're excited to use our software every single day.
Maybe we could talk about the people on the internal side of this. So I, as the executive who's making this choice, I've got a team who needs to be in place to get this thing up and running once it's happening. What are some of the pieces that I should align at the start of this project so that we're going to find success?
Yeah. So I'm a big proponent of surveying, potential users, right? And not just administrators, right, or these power users that are going to be, very involved in the implementation, but, end users that might just touch the software once a month, for instance. So getting everyone's perspectives, right? And I think it has a little bit of a secondary benefit because end users typically get involved too late, right? They have a new software, a new process. There's a little bit of resistance. So we want to make sure that we bring them in early so their voices are heard up front, but they also start getting a little buy-in and start getting excited, for the upcoming deployment. And, I think it's critical getting everyone's perspectives internally. And, oftentimes early in these software evaluations, it's a great time to also do a little external research. There's a lot of great analysts in the EPM space. There's, I would say, a welcome network of, CFOs as well. And obviously here at a great event, everyone's extremely friendly and, sharing best practices, lessons learned, the pains and the triumphs. So, yeah, I think talking to a lot of people internally up front, I think, is great, and especially externally to some of these folks that maybe have a good view of all the software vendors in the space.
So And you've mentioned CFOs, who obviously are a huge part of this conversation,
Yep.
but do they have peers within their organization, other C titles who maybe should be involved in the conversation? What has your experience been in terms of maybe they bring in the chief supply chain officer or the chief information officer?
Yeah, I think it certainly depends. Also, maybe the line of businesses that are involved in the implementation, the controllers, for sure, CTOs, CIOs, and that whole chain all the way down. So a lot of folks from IT. We see also what's interesting, and it probably changed since we talked last year. We talk to a lot more folks in digital transformation. So you've got your chief transformation officer or your, technologist enablement, but it's almost like this bridge, business function between finance and IT, which is something, we started noticing maybe last year, and, the trend just keeps going. So, certainly those folks, I would say, would be heavily involved as well.
I wonder if we could skip ahead a little bit. So, I mean, we started off talking about sort of this broad lay of the land and pros and cons of different options.
Yeah.
Let's imagine we get it down to maybe two really good options, and we have to decide between them. They're sort of neck and neck. There's a little bit of pluses here and a little bit of negatives there. But how are we figuring out what is the right choice in the end?
Yeah. So, and these decisions, I think, sometimes I'm not envious of organizations because it can be challenging, right? Picking the right software. But if you're down to your last two or three, I think it's a good idea to consider, proof of concepts, right? Or maybe pilots or almost mini implementations with your vendors. Because what that forces the software suppliers to do is no longer go with standard kind of pretty canned demo examples, right, that they maybe show to every prospective organization. And if you do choose to go down the POC route, I'm a big proponent of organizations providing these software vendors real samples of data, right? With your real data, your data structures, if you're concerned about a lot of data in terms of volumes, right, and performance, give these vendors a lot of data. And I think, functionally, it should alleviate a little bit of concern about can the software do X, Y, and Z. But more importantly, if you engage in the build with the vendor, I think it's the best way to understand how the underlying product works. So if you're, shopping around for software, it's a great way to understand functionally how does it really work behind the scenes. But more importantly, how do the people with that software provider also work? How is the services team? We talked about the cultural alignment. This is not something that you can properly assess in a PowerPoint slide or in an RFP submission or like in an orals presentation, right? So, working and co-building with these vendors and their implementation teams in a POC with your data, it's almost like a test run before you potentially go with a pretty large, and risky investment, right? Or an investment that, has a lot of eyeballs on it that has to go well.
What does success look like in that scenario? So I think there's probably some ideas and some metrics that are put in place, and you want to see them getting ticked off during the test phase. So what does that process look like?
Yeah, so there's always the success criteria, the checklist. Can it do this? Can it do that? Is it fast enough, right? Or can my report look like this? So there's a lot of functional check marks, but I think, if you walk away at the end of a POC and if you're a prospective, customer, and you're excited to do more in that POC. So say we just, tackled a little subset of data for forecasting, and we finish and you walk away saying, hey, I would love to try account reconciliation now. That to me is probably the best example of that eagerness, that excitement, that readiness to take on the challenge and, obviously enjoying working with the software since you want to do more. So maybe not so quantitative, won't show up in like an ROI analysis, but if you sense genuine excitement to do more, I think it's a pretty strong signal that you can send internally to your organization.
I love the idea of the tool persuading hearts and minds. Like it's actually an emotional connection to like I am it's the unquantifiable that is quantified. That's great.
Oh yeah, and it goes from the top of the house, right, with the CFO, all the way down to the end users. And I would say getting end users excited to get into the system and use it, you need that, right? Because you can have the best product, the best services team, implemented the best way possible. But if these users aren't excited to log in, it's going to be tough to really make that a successful digital transformation with, of course, without a lot of change management, enablement, and all of that, boilerplate stuff.
Okay, let's take one more step. Let's imagine we've made our choice, we're pulling the trigger, this is the one. Has it been your experience appointing someone to be in charge of getting that tool out there, to actually have an ambassador who makes it happen? Is that the best approach, or is it something that should come from the top down? How do we roll out this implementation to find success?
Yeah, I think, it's generating excitement, across the board. So, of course, you need that executive sponsorship, right? So I think it's important for the teams that are working on the implementation to know that this is a strategic investment, right, that will have a meaningful impact on my organization, right? It's part of the long-term strategy that we hear the C-suite talking about on their quarterly, calls and earnings reports. I think it's extremely important to also get that kind of excitement with a little groundswell with these users. So when folks are, at the proverbial water cooler, even if they're remote, they're talking about, hey, we've got this implementation coming. Those things matter. But ultimately, yeah, you do need those spokespeople, typically the folks that are leading the project, that are going to be, investing a lot of time, oftentimes even putting a pause on their day-to-day activities, right? Because these transformations are, arduous, and they do take some time. There's going to be ups and downs, so it's important having folks that can kind of have an even mentality, not get too high, not too low, but above all else, just keep going towards that North Star with the end in mind, and just pulling all these different teams together.
Terrific. Well, before I let you go, I do want to talk a little bit about you and your organization, because I feel you've been a real resource to a lot of companies that are making these kind of decisions. Can you get sort of in a nutshell, what is it that your organization is doing in this space?
Yeah, so we're, CCH Tagetik, we're a leader in the EPM space. We're the only unified platform that does planning, consolidation, account rec, tax, regulatory reporting as well, in-one solution running natively on SAP HANA. So, it's tough in a saturated market to have clear differentiators. We feel strongly that our technological alignment and our approach is an extremely compelling, alternative to organizations that are maybe have an SAP ecosystem and a back end, and maybe have a legacy tool in place today that's end of life, and they're looking for alternatives. So we make IT happy with the HANA relationship. We make finance happy with all of our financial intelligence, and we make users happy with all the automation that we have in the platform.
Amazing. Well, I know we've covered a lot of ground in this conversation.
Yes, we did.
If there are a couple of things you want people to think about a little further, what would you want to highlight for them?
It's a good question. I mean, I wouldn't get overwhelmed. There's a lot out there. A lot of EPM tools do a lot of things. So it could seem overwhelming that, hey, we've got to change our account rec process, and we've got to get aligned to GMT, and we've got ESG requirements in Europe, right? So it's important to take a step back, and especially during the implementation, try and find that first win and a quick win, right? So don't go for a big bang approach, but try and get something that can bring even a little bit of value to the organization sooner rather than later, because then it's got that snowball effect, and more people get excited, more hands on deck, and then it starts to kind of flow from there with other processes, enhancements, things like that. So basically, crawl, walk, run, one step at a time.
At the very beginning of this, you were saying, organizations come into this conversation from all kinds of different places with all kinds of different wants and needs. So I imagine anyone who's listened to this whole thing probably has some very specific things they'd like to ask. For people who want to ask questions, learn more, what is the best way to get in touch?
With me personally, I'm on LinkedIn, CCH Tagetik, the website. We've got a lot of great assets there, even, just vendor agnostic software checklists. So a lot of good collateral on the website as well from Tagetik.
Well, I always like to say it's so generous when someone says, reach out to me on LinkedIn, because I get the opportunity to speak to you, and it's nice that everyone else does as well. I'll also add, I've been to your website, and it does have a lot of great resources. So I encourage people, whichever version of that you like, it is a great resource. In the meantime, I want to say, Rob, thank you so much for your time today. This has been great.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. I love talking shop, and I really enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate it.
You've been listening to another episode of Executive Platform's Blueprint podcast series. I've been Jeff Nix. Let's do it again soon.